The roar of the crowd echoed across the vast expanse of the Galactic Arena, a coliseum that floated in orbit above the gas giant Tarsus 9. Laera stood in the center of the bloodstained sands, her hands shackled in shimmering energy chains that pulsed with a dull, unrelenting hum. The arena lights gleamed off her bronze skin, accentuating the determined glare in her violet eyes. She adjusted her grip on the glaive that had been tossed at her moments before, its weight a cruel reminder of her forced participation in this brutal spectacle. The announcer's voice boomed across the arena, amplified by an array of floating drones that circled the combatants like vultures waiting for a feast. Ladies and sentients of all species, prepare for carnage. Witness the pride of Valoria, the indomitable Laera, as she faces the nightmare of Androki's Prime the Venom Maw. A gate creaked open on the far side of the arena, and a monstrous creature slithered out. The Venom Maw was a grotesque amalgamation of fangs, scales, and muscle, its serpentine body coiled with sinewy strength. Its eyes, 6 in total, gleamed with a malevolent intelligence as it hissed, spraying acid onto the ground and leaving smoking craters in its wake. Laera tightened her grip on the glaive, the chains around her wrists buzzing with every movement. The crowd erupted into cheers, their chants a sickening mix of anticipation and bloodlust. She had fought countless creatures since her capture, but the Venom Maw was a different breed altogether. Its reputation as an undefeated killer preceded it, and Laera could see why. The first strike came fast. The creature lunged, its jaws snapping with a deafening crack that sent shockwaves through the arena floor. Laera sidestepped just in time, her chains dragging behind her as she pivoted and slashed at its flank. The glaive's blade met the creature's scales with a metallic clang, barely leaving a scratch. The crowd roared, their cries a mixture of approval and mockery. For them, this was entertainment, a spectacle of survival. For Laera, it was another day in a living nightmare. She darted backward as the creature swung its massive tail, the force of the blow sending sand and debris flying into the air. Her mind raced, calculating the Venom Maw's movements. It was fast, but its strikes were predictable. She could use that. She had to use that. Survival was her only option, escape was a dream she had long since abandoned. The chains around her wrists burned with each movement, sapping her strength as they pulsed with energy. They were designed to keep her in line, to remind her that she was no longer a free woman. Once a commander in the Valorian Starfleet, Laera had been captured during a border skirmish and sold to the arenas. Her captors had stripped her of her rank, her ship, and her freedom, but not her will to fight. The Venom Maw hissed again, rearing back as it prepared to strike. Laera saw her opening. She feinted to the left, baiting the creature into lunging in that direction, then spun to the right and drove her glaive into the soft, fleshy underside of its jaw. The beast shrieked, thrashing wildly as green blood sprayed across the arena floor. The crowd erupted in a cacophony of cheers and boos, their emotions as volatile as the creature itself. Laera pulled the glaive free and prepared for the next attack, but the Venom Maw was already faltering. Its movements became sluggish, its massive body swaying as the poison from its own blood seeped into its system. Laera stood over the creature as it collapsed, its final hiss fading into silence. Her chest heaved as she looked up at the crowd, her gaze defiant despite her exhaustion. The announcer's voice boomed again, declaring her victory, but Laera heard none of it. Her focus was on the stars visible through the transparent dome above the arena, a reminder of the freedom that lay just out of reach. As the guards approached to shackle her once more and drag her back to her cell, Laera clenched her fists, the energy chains buzzing in response. One day, she thought. One day, she would break free. She would return to the stars, where no chains could hold her. For now, she was a prisoner, but her spirit remained unbroken. And in the vastness of the galaxy, she knew that destiny had plans far greater than the confines of the arena. The galactic arena buzzed with energy as Laera was escorted back to her holding cell. Her limbs ached, her body bruised from countless battles, but her mind remained razor-sharp. She studied her surroundings as the guards led her through the labyrinthine corridors of the arena's underbelly, memorizing every turn and detail. The guards, oblivious to her scrutiny, barked at her to keep moving. They were used to seeing broken fighters. Liara was an anomaly, her defiance a rarity in the pits of despair. As the heavy cell door clanged shut behind her, Liara allowed herself a moment to exhale. Her cell was a small, dimly lit chamber with nothing but a cot and a viewport offering a sliver of the stars beyond. She stared at them, her thoughts drifting to the life she had lost, the commanding officer's uniform she once wore, the crew who had trusted her, the battles she had fought for justice. Now she was here, forced to entertain bloodthirsty crowds. But tonight, there was something different in the air. The next match was hours away, yet the arena's spectators were unusually restless. Cheers and laughter echoed through the walls, mingling with the murmur of excited conversation. Curious, Liara moved to her viewport, peering out at the crowd gathering in the spectator stands. Among them, one figure caught her eye, a man with dark, unruly hair and a cocky grin that didn't quite match the glittering aristocrats around him. He wasn't like the usual crowd. Kale. He lounged casually in a prime seat, flipping a coin between his fingers as though the arena's brutal spectacle was merely a passing amusement. Liara had no idea who he was, but there was something about him that set him apart. He was too relaxed, too unbothered by the chaos surrounding him. And though she couldn't be sure, she thought his eyes lingered on her cell block a little too long. Kale leaned back in his seat, letting the noise of the crowd wash over him. He had spent weeks tracking rumors of Liara, the Valorian warrior-turned-prisoner whose feats in the arena had become the stuff of legend. For Kale, it wasn't just her reputation that intrigued him, it was the injustice of it all. She was a commander, a hero, and now a slave for the entertainment of the wealthy and cruel. It didn't sit right with him, and Kale had learned long ago to trust his gut. Besides, he owed the Valorians. Years ago, they had saved him from a pirate blockade, and though he had repaid them in gold and favors, he'd never quite shaken the debt he felt. Liara's story was the perfect excuse to even the score. Kale's plan was simple, or as simple as plans ever got in the Galactic arena. He'd bluff his way into the underbelly, disable the energy chains holding Liara, and stage a quick escape before the guards realized what was happening. He was good at improvisation. It was why he was still alive despite the countless bounties on his head. What Kale hadn't accounted for, however, was just how closely Liara was being watched. Hours later, the arena floor was illuminated once more. Liara was summoned, her chains reactivated and her glaive thrust into her hands. The announcer's voice boomed across the arena, hyping up the next match. But this time, Liara wasn't alone. To her shock, another figure was announced, a so-called challenger who had volunteered to fight alongside her. The gates opened, and Kale strode into the arena, his roguish grin firmly in place. The crowd erupted in laughter and jeers. He didn't look like a warrior, clad in nothing but a patched jacket and wielding a stolen blaster. Liara stared at him, her confusion quickly replaced by anger. "What are you doing here?" she hissed under her breath as he joined her in the center of the arena. "Saving you," Kale replied nonchalantly, spinning his blaster in his hand. "Or at least, trying to. Look, I'm good at these kinds of things." "Do I look like someone who needs saving?" she snapped. Kale opened his mouth to retort, but the ground beneath him trembled. The next opponent was arriving. The massive gates at the far end of the arena groaned open, revealing not one but 3 hulking creatures. Clad in spiked armor and bristling with weaponry, they were gladiators from the Zarnan wastes, known for their ruthlessness. Kale's cocky grin faltered. "Okay, maybe I underestimated the stakes here." Liara rolled her eyes and readied her glaive. "Stay out of my way, pirate." The battle erupted with a fury that shook the arena to its core. Liara moved with precision, her glaive slicing through the air in arcs of deadly light. Kale, despite his lack of finesse, proved to be a quick shot and an even quicker thinker. As the Zarnan gladiators closed in, he used the terrain to his advantage, leaping onto ledges and firing at weak points in their armor. Their teamwork, though unplanned, was surprisingly effective. Kale provided cover fire while Laera delivered the killing blows, their movements gradually sinking as they adapted to each other's rhythm. The crowd's laughter turned to roars of approval, their bloodlust temporarily sated by the spectacle. When the last Zarnan fell, the arena fell silent for a moment before erupting into deafening cheers. Laera and Kale stood back to back, bloodied but victorious. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Laera felt a flicker of hope. As they were escorted back to the holding cells, Kale leaned toward her and whispered, "This isn't over. I've got a plan." Laera narrowed her eyes but didn't reply. She wasn't sure if she could trust him, but one thing was clear: Kale had changed the game. And for the first time, the stars seemed just a little closer. The arena erupted in chaos. Kale's whispered promise of a plan turned out to be less about strategy and more about his usual brand of improvisation. As the pair were marched through the arena's underbelly by heavily armed guards, Kale leaned casually toward Laera, his lips barely moving. "Ready to make some noise?" Laera shot him a glare. "What do you mean, noise?" Kale smirked and subtly held up a small, spherical device hidden in his palm. It was an EMP grenade, cobbled together from scraps he had smuggled into the arena. Laera's eyes widened. "You brought that into a high-security arena?" "Of course. What kind of rogue do you think I am?" Kale winked. The guards barked at them to keep moving, but Kale's grin only widened. With a flick of his thumb, he armed the grenade and dropped it to the floor. A moment later, the device emitted a high-pitched whine, then exploded in a burst of electromagnetic energy. The lights in the corridor flickered and died, plunging the entire section into darkness. The energy chains binding Laera's wrists fizzled and deactivated, and the guards' weapons shorted out with sparks. "Go!" Kale shouted. Laera didn't need to be told twice. She spun on her heel, disarming the nearest guard with a sharp twist of her newly freed hands. Her glaive had been confiscated, but her combat training was more than enough. In the dim light, she fought with brutal efficiency, her movements honed by years of military service. Kale, meanwhile, had snatched a fallen blaster and was firing wild but accurate shots, creating chaos among the disoriented guards. "This way," he yelled, motioning toward a service tunnel that led deeper into the arena's infrastructure. The two sprinted down the corridor, their footsteps echoing in the metal passageway. Alarms blared overhead, and Laera knew it was only a matter of time before reinforcements arrived. "Tell me you have a plan beyond run," she said, her voice sharp as they rounded a corner. "Run faster," Kale quipped, his grin unshaken. They burst into a maintenance bay, where Kale had stashed a stolen hovercart earlier that day. It wasn't much a rickety, single-engine vehicle more suited for transporting supplies than escaping a high-security arena, but it was their only chance. "Get in!" Kale shouted, vaulting into the driver's seat. Laera hesitated for half a second, then leapt onto the cart as Kale gunned the engine. The hovercart roared to life, sputtering as it lifted off the ground and shot down the maintenance tunnel. Behind them, the sound of boots and shouting guards grew louder. As the hovercart careened through the winding tunnels, Kale handed Laera a data pad. "Here," he said. "Coordinates to a ship waiting for us in orbit." Laera glanced at him, her expression skeptical. "A ship? You have a ship?" "Well, technically, I borrowed it. Temporarily." "Of course you did," she muttered, shaking her head. But her focus quickly returned to the task at hand. She scanned the tunnels ahead, directing Kale to avoid dead ends and security checkpoints. The hovercart burst out of the tunnels and into a massive hangar, where Draxus, the arena's overlord, awaited them with his elite guards. Draxus was a towering figure, his armor gleaming with crimson accents that signified his rank and wealth. His face was a mask of fury as he stepped forward, his voice booming across the hangar. You dare defy me? You think you can escape my arena? Laera stepped off the hovercart, her stance defiant. Your arena is nothing but a cage. And I've spent my life breaking out of cages. Draxus sneered and motioned to his guards. Kill them. The fight that followed was unlike anything Laera had faced before. Draxus's elite guards were equipped with advanced weaponry and armor, their coordination flawless. But Laera and Kale fought with desperation and determination. Laera used a fallen staff to deflect attacks, her movements precise and deadly. Kale, though outmatched in raw strength, relied on his cunning and quick reflexes, weaving through the chaos to disable the guards' weapons. As the battle raged, Laera's eyes locked onto Draxus. She could see the arrogance in his posture, the overconfidence of a man who had never truly fought for his life. She surged forward, engaging him in combat. His strikes were powerful, but Laera was faster, her training as a commander shining through. With a final, well-placed blow, she knocked him to the ground. Kale appeared beside her, panting but grinning. Not bad for someone who didn't need saving. Laera rolled her eyes, but allowed herself a small smile. Don't get used to it. The pair boarded a small shuttle at the far end of the hangar, its engines already primed for takeoff. As they ascended into orbit, Laera looked out the viewport at the shrinking arena below. For the first time in years, she felt the weight of her chains lifting, not just the physical ones, but the emotional scars of captivity. Kale piloted the shuttle with surprising skill, inputting the coordinates for the borrowed ship. We've got a lot of people after us now, he said, his tone light but serious. Laera crossed her arms, her gaze resolute. Let them come. They'll learn the hard way that I'm not someone to chain. Kale chuckled, his grin as roguish as ever. Something tells me this is the start of a beautiful partnership. Laera smirked, her eyes on the stars. Let's see how long you can keep up, pirate. The shuttle vanished into the vastness of space, leaving the arena and its chains far behind. The stolen shuttle raced through hyperspace, its engines humming with a rhythm that felt like freedom. Laera sat in the co-pilot seat, her fingers brushing against the controls. Though the ship was barely more than a glorified cargo hauler, it represented something she hadn't felt in years: choice. She could steer it anywhere, chart a course to any corner of the galaxy. And for the first time, she wasn't alone. Kale lounged in the pilot's chair, his boots propped up on the dashboard as he flipped through a star chart on the console. I've got a lead on a safe port, he said, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. An old contact of mine runs a repair shop in the Atrova Belt. We can lay low there, refuel, and figure out our next move. Laera raised an eyebrow. Safe port? With you? That seems unlikely. Kale grinned, unbothered by the jab. Hey, I'm an expert at staying alive. Trust me. Trust you? Laera crossed her arms. You jumped into an arena with no plan and nearly got us killed. Nearly, Kale corrected with a wink. But here we are, alive and free. That counts for something, doesn't it? Laera's lips twitched into the faintest hint of a smile. She wouldn't admit it, but Kale's recklessness had been the spark that reignited her hope. She turned back to the viewport, watching the swirling colors of hyperspace fade as the ship dropped back into normal space. Before them stretched the Atrova Belt, a chaotic expanse of asteroids and debris orbiting a dying star. Hidden within the maze of rocks and ice was their destination, a ramshackle space station known as Haven's Edge. It was a hub for smugglers, mercenaries, and outlaws, Kale's kind of people. As the ship docked, Laera took in the station's gritty surroundings. The air was thick with the scent of engine oil and burning plasma, and the corridors were alive with the murmur of deals being struck and secrets being whispered. Kale led her through the winding halls, nodding to a few familiar faces and avoiding others. They arrived at a small repair bay run by a grizzled Zarnan named Ralvik. His 4 eyes narrowed as he spotted Kale. You've got some nerve showing your face here, pirate, Ralvik growled, his voice like grinding gravel. Kale raised his hands in mock surrender. Ralvek, my friend. Don't tell me you're still mad about that tiny misunderstanding on Draconis. Ralvek's glare didn't soften, but his curiosity flicked to Laera. And who's this? Laera stepped forward, her posture commanding despite the exhaustion that lingered in her body. Laera of Valoria. And I'm here because your station's reputation says you know how to stay off the radar. Ralvek steadied her for a moment, then snorted. You've got guts, Valorian. Fine. You're welcome here for now. But keep your pirate on a leash. Kale chuckled. She's not the leash kind, Ralvek. While Ralvek's team worked on the ship, Laera and Kale holed up in a small room overlooking the docks. It was cramped, with only a single cot and a rickety table, but it was quiet. For Laera, the silence was unnerving. After years of the constant noise of the arena, she wasn't used to stillness. Kale leaned against the wall, arms crossed. So, Commander, he said, using her old title with a touch of reverence. What's the plan now? We've got a ship, a little freedom. But what comes next? Laera stared at the galaxy map on the console, her fingers tracing the star systems. The arenas, she said, her voice steady. They have to be stopped. Kale blinked, then whistled. That's ambitious. You realize the arenas are controlled by the Syndicate, right? The most powerful criminal organization in the galaxy. They've got armies, fleets, resources. And they're enslaving people, Laera shot back, her eyes fierce. They're profiting off blood and suffering. Someone has to fight them. Kale studied her, his usual smirk replaced by something more serious. You're not just talking about freedom for yourself. You want to take them all down. Laera nodded. I've seen what they do to people. I won't let it continue. Kale was silent for a moment, then grinned. Well, I didn't steal that ship just to fly around aimlessly. I'm in. You're in? Laera arched an eyebrow. Just like that? Sure, Kale said, leaning forward. Taking down the Syndicate? Sounds like my kind of chaos. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of planning, recruiting, and building alliances. Laera and Kale traveled across the galaxy, contacting former arena fighters, rebels, and those who had suffered under the Syndicate's rule. With each new ally, their cause grew stronger. Kale proved invaluable, his charm and resourcefulness opening doors Laera couldn't. And though she hated to admit it, she found herself trusting him not just as an ally, but as a friend. One day, as they stood on the bridge of their growing fleet, Kale turned to her. You know, he said, when I jumped into that arena, I didn't think I'd end up leading a rebellion. Laera smirked. And I didn't think I'd end up trusting a pirate. Kale grinned. Guess we're full of surprises. The fleet's engines roared to life, the stars beckoning them toward their next battle. Laera stood at the helm, her heart steady. She had been chained, broken, and stripped of everything, but now, she was free. And she wouldn't stop until the galaxy was free with her. The stars stretched out before them, infinite and full of possibilities. Together, they would make their mark, leaving no chain unbroken and no tyrant standing.